Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
Today, we're strapping in for what I can only describe as, well, the foundational course in everything that makes the modern world spin: globalization.
Yeah, absolutely. But we're definitely not just stopping at the textbook definition, are we?
Not a chance.
We've synthesized a huge stack of sources here. I mean, really complex definitions, deep historical timelines, some critical economic theories, political critiques.
It's a lot.
It is, but we've designed it specifically for, the curious learner who wants a true shortcut to being genuinely well-informed.
So our mission today is a real deep dive into this, well, this phenomenon and process. We want to distill the core concepts, the mechanical drivers, the political challenges.
Right, the whole interconnected web of power, people, and profits that really defines things now.
Exactly. We want to cut through all the noise and figure out what this incredible level of global integration actually means for you, the individual participant, right now, today.
And maybe to set our sights, we need to introduce this concept of globality. It's a key term.
Globality.
Okay, yeah, the academic Manfred Steiger uses it for the social condition that globalization is kind of moving towards.
So like an end goal.
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah.
It's not just a buzzword. It's this potential future state characterized by such tight economic, political, cultural, environmental interconnections that theoretically national borders start to lose their practical day-to-day significance.
Wow. Okay. That's a pretty powerful idea. A world where borders actually matter less.
It implies huge shifts.
Yeah.
Shared climate policy,
Yeah.
maybe universal digital IDs, much more integrated financial systems, things like that.
But, okay, to even approach that destination, that globality, we have to recognize that globalization itself is this massive journey, right?
So definitely, our sources frame it as having this dual nature. It's both a continuous process, like a dynamic force, always reshaping societies, and the global order.
And it's also an observable phenomenon, something you can actually see through the spread of practices, institutions, relationships worldwide.
Exactly. You can point to it. And the relevance here couldn't be higher, really.
I mean, it's inescapable.
Totally. The sources make a point that everyone engages with globalization daily, whether it's, the technology in your pocket,
Which was probably designed in California.
manufactured in China.
Sold by, who knows, maybe a Dutch-owned retailer.
Right. Or just the communication that connects you instantly across continents. It's seen by many as the cure for parochialism.
Parochialism, meaning narrow-mindedness.
Yeah, basically being stuck in your local bubble. Globalization forces individuals to constantly compare their local conditions, their rights, their ideas, against a global standard. It opens up horizons that just, weren't visible even a generation ago.
Okay, so let's start with that all-important foundational definition. When scholars try to, pin down this multi-headed monster, what language do they actually use? We found a really good multidimensional definition from Held and McGrew that truly breaks down the actions involved.
It is dense, I'll admit, but it's essential. They define globalization as a multidimensional set of social processes that create, multiply, stretch, and intensify worldwide social interdependencies and exchanges,
Okay, hold on. Create, multiply, stretch, intensify.
while at the same time fostering in people a growing awareness of deepening connections between the local and the distant.
Right. Let's slow that down a bit. If you break that definition apart, there are 5 key actions happening there.
Exactly.
It's about the creation and multiplication of activity, the stretching of relationships across space,
Like distance doesn't matter as much,
the intensification of those flows, things moving faster,
and more frequently.
and finally fostering that global awareness we just talked about.
Yeah. It means globalization isn't just about, how many shipping containers cross the ocean. It's a complete societal and psychological overhaul.
That's a big claim.
It is. And as an observable phenomenon, something we can actually see, our sources identify 4 defining qualities that make this current era, unique and qualitatively different from previous periods of global exchange.
Okay, let's hear them. What's the first one?
The first is that creation and multiplication element. This is driven mostly by innovation.
Like technology.
Yeah, think of moments like the invention of the printing press, or much more recently, the internet. These aren't just small incremental changes. They introduce entirely new activities, new institutions, new interactions that fundamentally alter traditional norms. They multiply the opportunities for global exchange.
Got it. New ways to connect and do things. What's second?
Secondly, we see expansion and stretching. This one's maybe the easiest to visualize.
Okay.
Local systems get pulled outward. right? They're integrated into wider global networks.
Mhm.
So, for instance, the demand for cocoa in, say, Switzerland doesn't just affect a local farm in Ghana.
No, it pulls that farmer right into...
Into a complex, standardized global supply chain. The geographical distance kind of shrinks as the operational reach stretches out.
Makes sense. Local becomes global. And the third quality.
The third is its sheer speed, intensification, and acceleration. Flows of information, goods, ideas. They're all moving with unprecedented velocity.
Like never before.
Right. The spread of mobile communication means financial transactions or even, political dissent can be organized and shared globally almost instantly. That rapid, continuous movement is arguably the key technological marker of modern globalization.
Speed changes everything. Okay, and the last one. The human element.
And finally, yes, the most human element, consciousness and awareness. It's often encapsulated by this term, the global imaginary.
The global imaginary. Sounds philosophical.
Kind of is. It's the collective mental shift, where individuals start to recognize that they're active participants in a larger global community, not just citizens of one isolated nation anymore.
So realizing we're all connected.
And that people are the main actors shaping the course of global events through their everyday choices, their innovations, their collective responses. It fundamentally changes how we think about problems. Everything from climate change to human rights.
Okay, those definitions seem pretty clear, pretty mechanical. But you mentioned disagreement.
Oh, yeah. Despite those clear definitions, not everyone agrees on what globalization is or even if it's a good thing. This is where the debate really heats up. Our sources lay out 4 major competing viewpoints.
All right, let's hear the different camps. Who's first?
The first camp, the hyper-globalists. These are the maximalists, the true believers, you could say.
Okay, what did they believe?
They believe this is an entirely new, beneficial, and transformative epoch in human history. For them, the free flow of capital and information, coupled with what they see as declining state power, leads inevitably to improved societies and potentially greater peace.
So globalization is fundamentally good and radically new.
That's their view, yeah, a positive break from the nationalistic past.
Okay, who's next?
Then you have the modifiers. They temper that enthusiasm quite a bit.
How so?
They recognize the current interconnectedness, sure, but they argue it's really not new. They point to long-standing historical exchanges,
Oh.
like those vast trade networks that existed long, long before 1492. For them, that's evidence that globalization has existed in earlier forms, just maybe slower ones.
So it's more evolution than revolution for the modifiers.
Exactly. It's a long historical process, not some sudden break.
Got it. Third group.
The third group are the powerful skeptics. Now, they argue that the scope and depth of globalization are, frankly, grossly exaggerated.
Exaggerated, but we just talked about the speed and intensity.
Right. But crucially, they often equate modern globalization primarily with Westernization or Americanization.
Ah, okay. So it's not truly global, it's just one culture dominating.
That's a core part of their argument.
Yeah.
And they emphasize that the whole process primarily benefits the wealthiest nations, the global north, while poorer states remain disadvantaged, maybe locked into dependent economic relationships.
So for the skeptics, it's inherently unequal by design.
That's the core of their critique, yes.
But wait a minute. If the hyperglobalists argue that technology allows, say, K-pop from Korea or Nollywood films from Nigeria to flow outwards, doesn't that counter the Western dominance narrative? Isn't there some cultural flow going the other way?
That's a really great challenge, and it's a valid point about cultural products. But the skeptics would likely push back and argue that while that cultural exchange is real, the underlying structure of power remains Western.
Meaning?
Meaning, who sets the standards for internet regulation? Who owns the majority of the big global financial institutions? Who really dominates the terms of international trade agreements?
Ah, the rules of the game are still set by the West.
For the skeptic, yes. As long as Western political and economic structures dictate those fundamental rules, the system is fundamentally serving their interests, regardless of how many Korean dramas you stream. The economic argument becomes much harder to ignore.
Okay, that makes sense. It's about the underlying power structure, not just the surface flows. And the fourth group.
And finally, we have the smallest, but sometimes the loudest group, the rejectionists.
Rejectionists. What do they reject?
They simply claim globalization is largely a myth or, fake. They deny that this level of global integration is real or meaningful enough to even warrant the term.
So they just don't buy it at all.
Pretty much. And understanding these 4 camps, hyperglobalist, modifier, skeptic, rejectionist, is really critical. because how you frame globalization.
As new and liberating, old and continuous, fundamentally unequal, or just unreal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That frame determines how you analyze all the economic and political shifts we're about to dive into. It's the lens through which you, the listener, will process the rest of this deep dive.
Okay, that intellectual lens brings us right to the history. How did we actually get here? Thomas Friedman, famously, suggests the modern accelerated era kicks off in 1492 with Columbus.
Right, that's his marker.
But as we just noted with the modifiers, that start date is hotly contested.
Very much so. Friedman's 1492 date focuses on a specific, maybe decisive turning point, the moment Europe achieved true, sustained transcontinental reach. But the evidence for long-standing interconnectedness is just overwhelming.
So way before Columbus.
Oh, absolutely. We have to
Uh-huh.
recognize systems like the Silk Road. This wasn't just one road, obviously, but a vast network connecting China, India, the Middle East, Europe, thriving from maybe the 13th century BCE onwards.
And it wasn't just goods, right?
Not at all. Goods, yes, but also culture, religion. Think about how Buddhism spread, and crucially, knowledge, technology, and unfortunately disease, too. That's global dependence on an epic scale, even if it was much, much slower than today.
And there were others too.
Definitely. Even more geographically expansive, perhaps, was the evidence supporting the Austronesian theory. This shows incredible maritime migration across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Ocean.
On boats. Across the Pacific.
Yeah, people mastering complex outrigger canoes, maybe even warships, enabling astonishing long-distance navigation. This created shared languages and cultures across thousands and thousands of miles of open ocean.
That's incredible.
It really is. The scale of this pre-modern global exchange, long before European ships dominated, is genuinely awe-inspiring, especially when you compare it to older, now largely debunked ideas like Bayer's waves of migration theory, and look at modern hypotheses like the out-of-Taiwan hypothesis for Austronesian origins.
So humans have always been moving and connecting.
Absolutely. But Friedman's framework, the one based on this size metaphor, is still incredibly useful for understanding the acceleration and the mechanism of integration across three distinct phases that profoundly changed global power dynamics.
Okay, let's break down Friedman's three phases then. Starting with what he calls the biggest world, where the main actors were states. Globalization 1.0. When was this?
This runs roughly from 1492 up to the 1800s, and he calls this the globalization of countries.
Countries as the main players.
Exactly. The primary actors here were the rising European nation-states, initially Spain and Portugal, then later England, France, the Netherlands.
And what drove them?
Their motivations were pretty purely transactional, you could say. Wealth extraction, acquiring territory, conquest. The whole phase was fundamentally launched by Columbus's voyage in 1492, which, opened the Western Hemisphere to massive European colonization and exploitation.
And the economic system driving this.
The dominant system was mercantilism.
Mercantilism. Okay, refresh my memory.
It's the system holding that a nation's power was directly linked to accumulating wealth, specifically through a favorable trade balance, meaning you export more than you import.
Got it. Sell more, buy less.
And crucially, this was underpinned by bullionism, where wealth was measured almost exclusively in the physical gold and silver reserves a country held.
Ah, so it was all about hoarding gold and silver.
Pretty much. And this is where the consequences for the rest of the world were just massive. Colonies weren't seen as partners at all.
No, they were just resources.
Exactly. Raw resource suppliers. The Spanish colonization of the Americas, and later the Philippines, was explicitly driven by the frantic search for gold and silver deposits. This resulted in a huge one-way flow of bullion back to Europe.
Which must have totally changed Europe's economy.
Well, fundamentally. It led to inflation, sure, but it also financed the incredibly rapid expansion of European influence, military power, and commerce worldwide.
And was there a key event that really cemented this shift? Friedman talks about the world shrinking.
Yeah, he sees this phase as shrinking the world from large down to medium. And the single key event that truly solidified this, that proved the world was interconnected and navigable by Europeans, was Magellan's attempted circumnavigation between 1519 and 1521.
Attempted, didn't he make it?
Well, Magellan himself actually died en route in the Philippines. But the expedition was completed by Juan Sebastian Elcano. It proved demonstrably that the globe could be circled, and that European naval power by the 16th century really held the keys to global commerce.
Okay, so that's 1.0. Countries, mercantilism, conquest, large to medium world. What's next?
Shifting gears, we move into globalization 2.0. This spans roughly the 1800s up until well, maybe the mid-20th century, or some argue even closer to the year 2000.
And this is the globalization of companies.
Right. The world shrinks dramatically again, according to Friedman, from medium down to small.
And what's the driving force here?
The Industrial Revolution, without a doubt. Originating in Europe, driven by huge innovations like the steam engine, the railway, the telegraph.
Things that connect and speed up production.
Exactly. This enabled mass production, the rise of factory systems, rapid urbanization, and just an unprecedented expansion of capitalist economies. The key shift here is that companies and eventually multinational corporations became central actors, operating on a global scale that started to challenge state control in some ways.
But this era wasn't exactly peaceful, was it?
Far from it. This era was violently interrupted and tragically defined by the incredible, horrifying, destructive capacity of industrial warfare.
World War I, World War II.
Precisely. Showing what happens when industrial production meets nationalism and global competition. But that tragedy, ironically, forced a profound political response.
Which was?
The recognition of a desperate need for institutionalized global peacekeeping and, crucially, economic management to prevent it from happening again.
Okay, so institutions emerge.
Exactly. After the League of Nations failed following World War I, the world got the United Nations in 1945, aiming for political stability. But for the economic structure, the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 was arguably the most critical step.
Bretton Woods, that sounds important.
Hugely important. This conference was convened specifically to prevent a repeat of the economic nationalism and protectionism that many believed led to the Great Depression and ultimately the war.
So what did it do?
It established the essential financial pillars of the modern global system that we still live with today. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, to ensure currency stability, the World Bank, initially the IBRD, to finance reconstruction and development, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, like free trade.
Which later became the WTO. Right?
Exactly, the World Trade Organization. These institutions basically dictated the rules of engagement for companies operating globally for decades.
Okay, so 2.0. Companies, Industrial Revolution, world wars leading to global institutions, medium to small world. That brings us to now.
And finally, yes, we arrive at the age we're currently living in, Globalization 3.0. This runs from maybe the mid-20th century, but really kicks into high gear with the rise of digital technology around the year 2000, continuing to the present.
And this is the radical globalization of individuals.
That's Friedman's term. And this is where he declares the world becomes truly flat, effectively shrinking from small to tiny, or maybe even size 0.
Because of?
The drivers are immediately familiar to all of us. Computers, the internet, fiber optics, digital technology, mobile communication, all allowing for instant communication and collaboration across the globe.
Right, the digital revolution.
And the profound impact, the really key shift, is the empowerment of the individual. You no longer need to be a powerful nation state, like in 1.0, or a massive corporation like in 2.0, to participate meaningfully in global networks.
Anyone can play now.
Potentially, yes. Our sources point out that a student with basic internet access in, say, rural India can instantly join an international conversation, access world-class educational resources online, or even launch a digital product globally, completely bypassing traditional gatekeepers like governments or big media companies.
Information becomes instantly shareable worldwide. Social media.
Exactly. It accelerates the pace of globalization beyond anything seen before. The power dynamic fundamentally shifts, moving away from purely centralized authority states and big companies towards, well, distributed civil society and the empowered, connected individual.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting because, let's face it, the economic structure kind of underpins everything else we've talked about.
It really does.
So let's properly define economic globalization. The IMF back in 2008 defined it pretty clearly as the increasing integration of economies worldwide through the movement across borders of goods, services, capital, and increasingly people and knowledge.
Right. It's about those flows becoming faster, larger, and more interconnected. And this integration isn't just transactional, like simple buying and selling. It's deeply systemic.
Systemic how?
Well, Tomas Entes provided a great analogy, calling the global economy an organic system. Think of it like an incredibly intricate web of transnational processes and interdependencies.
An organic system? Like a living body?
Kind of, yeah. It means that an economic crisis in one part of the world inevitably spills across borders, often very quickly, because the entire system is linked together.
We saw that play out vividly with the 2008 global financial crisis, didn't we?
Absolutely. Textbook example. It originated in the U.S. subprime mortgage market, a seemingly specific, localized
But
problem.
it didn't stay local.
Not at all. Because major banks and financial institutions across Europe and Asia were deeply tied into U.S. capital markets, holding those complex mortgage-backed securities. The shockwaves instantly propagated. They dragged down economies from Dublin to Tokyo almost overnight.
That's the reality of an organic system, then. A crisis in one lung affects the entire body.
Precisely. And this intense interdependence is driven by what economists call the global division of labor.
Meaning different places do different things.
In a highly specialized way, yes. We see extreme specialization across states, or even regions within states. Silicon Valley focuses on R&D and high technology.
East Asia often handles manufacturing and assembly.
The Middle East specializes in resource extraction like oil. Germany in high-end engineering.
And then they all trade with each other.
Exactly. They exchange their highly specialized outputs in a single, incredibly complex global production chain. Your smartphone is the classic example: components from dozens of countries, assembled in another, software developed elsewhere.
Okay. Now, to navigate that whole system, we have to look at the economic philosophies that guide it. You mentioned capitalism earlier.
Right. You have the theoretical ideal of the pure market economy, rooted in classical liberalism, especially Adam Smith's idea of the invisible hand.
The invisible hand.
The belief that individual, self-interested actors competing freely in the marketplace will ultimately maximize overall social welfare without needing government interference. The market finds the best outcome on its own.
Okay, that's one pole. What's the opposite?
On the opposite pole, you have the command economy, where the state centrally controls all major aspects of the economy: production levels, prices, resource allocation, wages. The Soviet Union was the prime historical example.
But neither of those extremes really describes most countries today, right?
No, not really. The reality today, across most of the global north and the global south, is that the mixed economy prevails.
A mix of market and state.
Exactly. This is rooted heavily in Keynesian ideas, basically. A recognition, especially after the Great Depression, that markets don't always self-correct perfectly. Sometimes they fail spectacularly.
Like in 2008.
Precisely. The massive U.S. government bailouts of banks and auto companies during the 2008 crisis are a textbook example of the mixed economy in action. Even strongly capitalist countries accept that government intervention is sometimes required to prevent total social and economic collapse. The state steps in when the invisible hand falters.
Okay, so we have these mixed economies integrating globally. How do we measure their wealth accurately in this interconnected system? It gets complicated, I bet.
It does. We absolutely have to clearly distinguish between GDP, gross domestic product, and GNI, gross national income.
GDP versus GNI. Okay, what's the difference?
GDP measures the total value of goods and services produced domestically, meaning within a country's geographical borders, regardless of who owns the production factors.
So what's made inside the country?
Right. GNI, on the other hand, is GDP plus something called NFIA, which stands for net factor income from abroad.
Net factor income from abroad. What's that?
NFIA accounts for the income earned by a country's residents and corporations globally, like profits from overseas investments or wages earned abroad, minus the income paid out from the domestic economy to foreign residents or corporations, like profits sent home by foreign companies operating locally.
Ah, okay. So GNI tracks where the money earned by a nation's people and companies actually ends up, not just where the stuff was physically made.
Exactly. And this distinction is absolutely critical in a globalized world with so much cross-border investment and migration. GNI gives you a much better picture of the actual income available to the people of a nation.
Can you give an example of why NFIA is so important?
Our sources highlighted a perfect real-world example: overseas Filipino worker OFW remittances.
Ah, yes. Huge numbers of Filipinos work abroad.
Millions. In the Middle East, North America, Europe on ships. And they send billions and billions of dollars back home to their families in the Philippines every single year.
So that money wasn't produced in the Philippines.
No, it wasn't part of the domestic GDP. But those remittances are massive NFIA inflows. They significantly raise the gross national income, GNI, of the Philippines far beyond what its domestic production GDP alone achieves.
Wow. So migration policy becomes economic policy.
Directly. It demonstrates vividly how migration flows and the income generated abroad are now inseparable from national economic performance and household welfare in many countries.
That really clarifies the GNI GDP difference. Now, are there other ways to measure national well-being besides just money?
Yes, and it's important to acknowledge that. Some nations explicitly reject this purely economic framing of progress. Bhutan is the most famous example, focusing instead on gross national happiness, GNH.
Gross national happiness, I've heard of that.
It prioritizes non-material aspects of welfare, things like environmental conservation, good governance, health, education, community vitality, psychological well-being, and cultural preservation, placing them on par with, or even above, mere quantitative GDP growth.
That's a powerful critique of the standard model.
It is. It's a reminder that development should ultimately be about improving the overall quality of life, not just churning out bigger financial reports each quarter.
Okay, so we have this globalized economy. What are the theories that justify how trade works within it? Who wins, who loses?
Well, the dominant theory underpinning most free trade agreements comes from classical liberalism. Adam Smith talked about absolute advantage, but it was David Ricardo's idea of comparative advantage that really took hold.
Comparative advantage, right.
Ricardo argued that mutual gains from trade exist even if one country is less efficient at producing everything compared to another country.
Wait, how does that work? If one country is better at making everything?
It works because of opportunity cost. As long as each country specializes in producing the goods where its relative disadvantage is smallest, meaning what it gives up the least to produce, then both countries can benefit by trading. It's about relative efficiency, not absolute.
So specialize in what you're least bad at, essentially.
Kind of, yes. Or what you're most good at, relative to other things you could be doing. That specialization, according to the theory, maximizes total global output and everyone benefits through trade. This is the cornerstone argument for global free trade.
Okay, that's the optimistic liberal view, but there must be critics.
Oh, definitely. The structuralist critique offers a much darker counterpoint. They warn that this comparative advantage system in the real world is inherently unequal and systematically disadvantages developing nations.
Oh, so?
They argue that core states, the wealthy industrialized nations, essentially exploit periphery. The poor, often raw material exporting nations, through the terms of trade.
Explain that, core and periphery.
Think of a powerful modern manufacturing nation, the core, negotiating the price of raw materials like coffee beans or minerals from a small, economically weaker, often former colonial nation, the periphery.
The core has more bargaining power.
Massively more. So the core buys the raw materials, cheap, say, unroasted coffee beans from an African nation. Then they process it, package it, brand it, and sell the finished high-value goods like fancy packaged coffee or high-tech electronics made using those raw materials back to the periphery and globally at a massive markup.
So the value is added in the core, not the periphery.
Exactly. This process, the structuralists argue, locks the periphery into a cycle of producing low-value primary commodities, remaining dependent on the core for manufactured goods and technology, and never really developing in a meaningful way. The trade benefits are heavily skewed towards the wealthy.
That directly challenges the liberal assumption of universal mutual gain from trade.
Completely. It suggests the structure itself is rigged.
And who are the big actors often perpetuating this division, according to the sources?
The most powerful non-state actors driving this are often the transnational corporations, TNCs, or multinational corporations.
Okay. Big global companies.
All right. These massive entities operate globally, investing in R&D in one country, manufacturing components in several others, assembling in another, and distributing and selling worldwide.
Their reach is enormous.
Their economic resources and global influence can easily rival or even exceed those of many small to mid-sized nation-states. They can dictate terms within global supply chains and heavily influence local and national policy decisions through lobbying or investment threats.
So they're engines of globalization, but also potential problems?
Definitely both. TNCs are undoubtedly engines of innovation, efficiency, and economic growth in many ways. They transfer technology and create jobs. But the risks and criticisms are immense.
Such as?
Market monopolization, where a few giant TNCs dominate an entire global sector. Documented cases of labor exploitation in developing countries with weak regulations. Environmental damage, and, crucially, complex tax avoidance schemes.
Tax avoidance, how do they manage that globally?
Well, for example, a TNC, like Apple, hypothetically, can design its product in the U.S., high R&D costs, maybe lower taxes on patents, have it manufactured cheaply by contractors in Asia, book the sales revenue in a low-tax country like Ireland, and then legally shift profits across these different jurisdictions to minimize their overall global tax bill.
That sounds incredibly
It
complex.
is. This complex international financial architecture creates huge governance challenges for individual states trying to capture tax revenue from genuinely global profits.
Okay, so managing these TNCs and global trade requires some serious coordination from governments.
Absolutely. Henry Now, in his work, synthesized this complexity into 7 interconnected policy levers, areas where governments make choices, both domestically and internationally, that shape trade outcomes and manage globalization's effects.
7 levers, what are they?
They include the big picture stuff, macroeconomic policies like managing interest rates, inflation, government spending,
Okay.
and specific microeconomic policies like industry subsidies or regulations targeting specific sectors. Then there are crucial governance policies, things like ensuring the rule of law, fighting corruption, protecting property rights. Without good governance, nothing else works well.
Makes sense. What else?
Exchange rate policies, how a country manages its currency's value against others, which directly impacts import-export prices.
Critical for trade.
Hugely.
Yeah.
And then 2 key trade-related levers. Actual trade policy itself, things like tariffs, quotas, trade agreements.
Like the rice example you mentioned.
Exactly. And investment policy rules about foreign ownership of companies or land, incentives for foreign direct investment.
Okay, that's 6. What's the 7th?
The 7th, which we saw the importance of with GNI, is migration policy rules governing the flow of people, both skilled and unskilled labor, across borders.
Let's focus on that trade policy example again. Race tariffication. You mentioned it's controversial.
Yes, it's a specific trade policy change. Many nations, including the Philippines, for instance, have implemented, often under pressure from international agreements or institutions. It involves replacing quantitative restrictions, like a strict quota on how much rice tonnage can be imported with tariffs, which are essentially taxes on imports.
So instead of blocking imports, you just tax them. What's the effect?
Well, the theory is that it opens local markets to potentially cheaper foreign rice, which could benefit consumers through lower prices. It also generates tariff revenue for the government.
Sounds okay in theory. What's the catch?
The catch is that it often severely harms local farmers, especially smallholders, who simply cannot compete on price with heavily subsidized rice coming from major agricultural exporters like Vietnam or Thailand. This can lead to falling incomes, displacement from farming, and significant domestic political and social unrest. It's a classic globalization trade-off.
Okay, so the ultimate takeaway here is that managing globalization isn't about just one thing, like lowering tariffs.
Not at all. Al's point is that these 7 levers interact constantly and complexly. Poor governance can completely undermine brilliant macroeconomic policy. Unbalanced migration flows can negate the benefits of foreign investment reforms. A nation's actual economic outcome from globalization depends entirely on how well it synchronizes and coordinates policies across all these diverse areas. It's a delicate balancing act.
Okay, let's shift focus now from the economics to the domain of power and politics. How does globalization affect how countries govern themselves and interact with each other?
This brings us to political globalization. It's broadly defined as the intensification of power interrelations among nations, but also increasingly above and below the nation-state level.
Above and below.
Yeah, meaning through international organizations above and through NGOs and individuals below. And this immediately raises a massive fundamental question about state sovereignty.
Sovereignty, the idea that a state has supreme, unchallenged authority within its own territory.
Exactly. And sovereignty traditionally has 2 key parts. There's internal sovereignty, the state's power to make and enforce laws domestically over its population.
Right.
And there's external sovereignty, the state's independence from outside control, its right to conduct its own foreign policy without interference.
And political globalization challenges both of these.
It certainly puts pressure on both. When a state signs an international treaty on, say, climate change or human rights or trade rules, it voluntarily consents to limits on its external autonomy. It agrees to follow international rules, even if it retains its internal power to govern its citizens day to day. The lines get blurry.
And crucially, as you mentioned, the world lacks a single centralized global government, right? There's no world president or planetary Supreme Court.
Absolutely not. We don't have anything resembling a global state with overarching authority. Instead, what we rely on is the far more complex, messy, and often frustrating system of global governance.
Global governance versus global government. Okay, what's the difference?
The World Health Organization, WHO, interestingly, provided a good definition back in 2015. Global governance is essentially the collective management of large-scale, transnational problems through international cooperation, consensus building, and shared frameworks or norms.
So it's about working together without a boss.
Pretty much. It involves multiple actors, not just states, but also intergovernmental organizations, IGOs, like the UN or the WTO, and increasingly non-state actors like NGOs and even corporations, all working together, ideally, through agreed guidelines and shared principles. It relies heavily on shared responsibility and voluntary compliance, not coercion, because no single entity can actually compel a sovereign state to act against its perceived interests.
All right, but you said it's messy and frustrating. Why does this system of voluntary cooperation actually work?
Well, it works sometimes, but it's inherently fragile and limited by three major structural issues. Our sources consistently highlight these three critical gaps in global governance.
Three gaps, what are they?
First, there's the jurisdiction gap. This highlights the fundamental lack of enforcement power in many critical areas.
Meaning no one's in charge to make sure rules are followed?
Essentially, yes. Global governance often struggles to act decisively on really major global issues. Think about enforcing human rights standards within a sovereign state, intervening effectively in civil wars, or enforcing sanctions against powerful nations that simply ignore them. For example, if a permanent member of the UN Security Council violates international law, the UN system itself lacks a clear, compelling authority to intervene without that state's voluntary consent because of the veto power. There's a wide area of critical issues where no global body has the legal right or the practical power to compel action.
Okay, so lack of enforcement power, that's a big one. What's the second gap?
Second is the incentive gap. This gap stems directly from the starkly unequal distribution of global power and resources.
How does that create a gap?
Because wealthy, powerful nations inherently have vastly more influence over the policy setting and decision-making processes within key international institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, or the WTO. Their votes often count more, literally or figuratively.
So the rules get written by the powerful.
Inevitably, this skews the incentives within the system towards their economic and political interests. It makes it much harder for global policy to truly prioritize the needs of developing nations or tackle problems where the costs fall heavily on the powerful states. The system's incentives are often designed by and favor the winners of the previous phases of globalization.
Okay, jurisdiction gap, incentive gap. What's the third?
And third, there's the participation gap. This reflects inequalities in representation and actual engagement in global decision-making.
Meaning not everyone gets a real say.
Partly, yes. Even when states technically have a seat at the table, say in a UN climate negotiation, states with massive political or economic weight can effectively sideline concerns of smaller nations. Or, more damagingly, powerful states can simply choose to abstain from or withdraw from international agreements that threaten their perceived sovereignty or short-term economic interests. Think about the U.S. pulling out of the Paris Agreement, for example.
And when major players don't participate?
Their non-participation severely limits the effectiveness and legitimacy of global policy. It means the most difficult global problems often involve the states least willing to fully commit to collective solutions, creating a huge gap between the need for action and the willingness to act.
Wow. Those three gaps, jurisdiction, incentive, participation, seem like massive hurdles for effective global cooperation.
They absolutely are, and they persist despite the significant evolution we've seen in international law.
How has international law evolved?
Well, traditionally, international law really only bound sovereign states. States made treaties with other states, but this has expanded massively over the last century or so.
To include?
Today, international law clearly recognizes international organizations, like the UN, EU, as legal subjects with rights and duties. And, perhaps most profoundly, it now increasingly includes individuals as subjects of international law, too.
Individuals, how does that work? I thought law was between states.
That was the old view. But the shift is huge. The clearest example is the Rome Statute, the treaty that established the International Criminal Court, ICC.
The ICC in The Hague.
Exactly. The ICC holds individual people, leaders, military commanders, etc., directly accountable under international law for the most serious crimes: genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the crime of aggression.
Even if their own country won't prosecute them.
Especially then. It signifies a massive philosophical shift. International law can now reach past the shield of state sovereignty to hold individuals responsible for violating fundamental global norms.
That's a major change. Now, how does this evolving international law actually relate to the laws within a country, the domestic or municipal law?
Uh, that relationship is a major source of legal debate and varies between countries. We see four main philosophical approaches described in the sources.
Four approaches. Okay.
First is monism. Monists believe that international law and domestic law form one single, unified legal system. In this view, international law is generally considered superior.
So if a country signs a treaty, it's automatically part of its domestic law.
In a pure monist system, yes.
Yeah.
A breach of international law would automatically be a breach of domestic law, theoretically enforceable in domestic courts.
Okay. What's the alternative?
The main alternative is dualism. Dualists hold that international law and domestic law are two completely separate and distinct legal systems. They operate on different planes.
Separate. So signing a treaty doesn't automatically change domestic law.
Correct. For an international treaty to have effect domestically in a dualist state, it usually needs to be explicitly incorporated into domestic law through specific legislation passed by the national parliament. A violation of an unincorporated treaty might be a breach internationally, but remain perfectly valid under local law.
That sounds like it could cause conflicts.
It can. There's also a more practical approach called harmonization or coordination. This view accepts they are distinct, but emphasizes that states should strive to ensure their domestic laws are consistent with their international obligations, actively integrating them through a deliberate legislative process.
So trying to make them work together.
Right. But regardless of which legal philosophy a state adopts, the entire structure of international relations, all these treaties and organizations, rests on one absolutely fundamental principle of trust.
Which is?
It's formalized in the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, using the Latin principle, pacta sunt servanda.
Pacta sunt servanda. Sounds important. What does it mean?
It translates simply but powerfully as agreements must be kept. It's the core ethical and legal commitment that states will honor the treaties they voluntarily enter into. Without this basic assumption of good faith, the entire architecture of international law and global governance would just collapse into anarchy.
Trust is the foundation. Okay. So, what are the key political institutions that provide this architecture that states work through?
Well, two major ones stand out in the post-WWII era. First, let's look at NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, established in 1949.
NATO, the military alliance.
Yes, but it functions in two ways, reflecting different theories of international relations. From a liberal perspective, it's seen as a political association of democracies promoting shared values and cooperation.
And the other view?
From a realist perspective, its primary function, especially during the Cold War, was as a collective security structure. Its core commitment, Article 5, states that an attack on one member is considered an attack on all members. It was fundamentally designed to deter Soviet threats.
So both political club and military shield.
Exactly. And then, of course, there is the massive near-universal entity of the United Nations, UN.
Established right after the war, 1945.
Yes, explicitly designed to replace the failed League of Nations and prevent another global conflict. It has 193 member states today, almost every country on Earth.
And its functions are incredibly broad, right?
Incredibly. They span everything from maintaining international peace and security to promoting sustainable development, protecting human rights, upholding international law, and delivering humanitarian aid. It's the central forum for global cooperation.
And how is it structured to do all that?
It manages this vast mandate through its 6 main organs. There's the General Assembly, which is the main deliberative policy-making body where all members have an equal vote, kind of the town hall of the world.
Okay.
Then the powerful Security Council, responsible for maintaining peace and security, with its 5 permanent veto-wielding members and 10 rotating members.
The P5 veto is often controversial.
Highly controversial, yes, linking back to that incentive gap. Then there's ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council, which coordinates the economic and social work of the UN and its specialized agencies.
Like WHO or UNESCO?
Exactly. There's the International Court of Justice, ICJ, the principal judicial organ, which settles legal disputes between states.
Okay.
The Secretariat, headed by the Secretary General, which carries out the day-to-day work of the UN. And finally, the Trusteeship Council, which was originally set up to oversee territories transitioning to independence and is now largely dormant as its work is complete.
So a complex structure trying to manage a complex world, despite those governance gaps.
Precisely. It's the best attempt we have at structured global political cooperation. Now, all these economic and political flows we've been discussing, they don't just move money and power around. They fundamentally shape our identities, our values, our ways of life. which brings us squarely into the cultural dimension of globalization.
Culture, this is where it gets personal, maybe.
Definitely. And the central philosophical debate here, the big question, is whether globalization leads primarily to cultural homogeneity, meaning everyone becomes more alike, a sort of uniform global culture, often criticized as Westernization or Americanization.
Like McDonald's everywhere.
That's the classic, maybe simplistic example, yes.
Right.
Or does it lead to cultural heterogeneity, meaning more diversity, more mixing, more fusion of cultures, creating new hybrid forms?
Homogeneity versus heterogeneity. Uniformity versus diversity. Which one is it?
Well, reality is probably much more complex than that simple binary. To help us move past it and understand these incredibly complex cultural flows, we can turn to Arjun Appadurai's really useful framework of 5 dynamic scapes.
5 scapes? Like landscapes?
Kind of, yeah. He uses scape to suggest these fluid, overlapping global cultural flows. They illustrate cultural globalization not as a single stream, but more like 5 interconnected, constantly shifting rivers.
Okay, interesting. What are the 5 scapes?
We start with ethnoscapes. This refers to the actual movement of people across borders: migrants, refugees, tourists, guest workers, exiles, diasporas. This constantly changes cultural landscapes as new populations arrive, bringing new languages, foods, religions, and customs, interacting with existing ones.
So the flow of people themselves. Got it. What's next?
Then there are technoscapes. This is the global configuration and rapid spread of technologies, both high and low tech, mechanical and informational, moving at high speed across previously impervious borders. Think about how quickly smartphone technology or specific industrial processes spread worldwide, creating shared global operating systems and communication channels.
Okay, ethnoscapes, technoscapes. Third.
Third are financescapes. This represents the incredibly complex, fast-moving, often abstract flows of global capital currency markets, stock exchanges, commodity speculation, investments. Huge sums of money moving electronically across the globe almost instantly, capable of stabilizing or destabilizing local economies very quickly.
The flow of money. Makes sense. Fourth.
Fourth are mediascapes. This refers both to the distribution of the electronic capabilities to produce and disseminate information, newspapers, magazines, television, film, internet, and also to the actual images and narratives of the world created by these media.
So how we see the world through media.
Exactly. And critically, our sources explicitly link this mediascape to the rise of the post-truth era.
Post-truth.
Yeah, where digitally distributed narratives, personalized news feeds, social media bubbles, misinformation and disinformation heavily shape public belief and identity worldwide, often spreading much faster than verified facts can travel. The mediascape is a battleground for narratives.
That sounds familiar. Okay, and the fifth scape.
And finally, ideoscapes. This refers to the flow of political ideas and ideologies. Often these are concatenations of concepts like freedom, welfare, rights, sovereignty, representation, and especially democracy circulating globally. But it also includes the flow of counter-ideologies, like radical nationalism or specific social movement ideas such as environmentalism or feminism.
So ethno, techno, finan, media, ideoscapes.
Right? These 5 scapes demonstrate that culture isn't simply being erased or homogenized. It's being constantly reshaped, contested, exchanged, and fused in incredibly complex and often unpredictable ways through these overlapping global flows.
That's a much more nuanced picture than just McDonald's versus local food.
Much more. And who are the key actors navigating and influencing these scapes, operating outside of states and large corporations?
Good question. Who?
This is where non-state actors become crucial, particularly global civil societies, GCS, and more specifically, non-governmental organizations, NGOs.
NGOs, we hear about them all the time. What are they exactly in this context?
They're essentially international or domestic networks of people and organizations that operate independently of governments and the private for-profit sector. Their primary focus is usually on influencing public policy, raising awareness about issues, providing services, and holding powerful actors, both states and corporations, accountable.
So they fill a vital space between the citizen and the state, or the consumer and the corporation.
Exactly. They act as essential bridges, advocates, and watchdogs. And to maintain their credibility and effectiveness, especially when they're criticizing powerful governments or TNCs, they generally need to possess 3 defining characteristics, according to our sources.
3 characteristics for NGOs. What are they?
First, they must have genuine independence, particularly from government control. This autonomy allows them the freedom to design their own programs, choose their advocacy positions, and criticize powerful entities without fear of political retribution or bias. Their credibility depends on it.
Makes sense. Independence. Second.
Second, they generally maintain a non-political nature, at least in the partisan sense. They are not political parties seeking to win elections or hold government power. Their involvement is typically limited to advocacy, awareness campaigns, lobbying, and trying to shape policy from the outside, not take over the state.
So influencing power, not seeking it.
Right. And finally, the third characteristic is their nonprofit orientation. NGOs are typically sustained by donations, grants, and sponsorships, not by selling goods or services for profit. This ensures, ideally, that their primary mission serves social, environmental, or humanitarian causes rather than generating returns for shareholders.
Okay, independence, non-political, non-profit. And these characteristics allow them to play specific roles.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
These characteristics enable NGOs to play probably 10 or more essential roles in global governance, often stepping in to fill those gaps. Jurisdiction, incentive, participation that we discussed earlier regarding states and IGOs.
10 roles. Can we look at a few crucial ones?
Sure. One of the most important is acting as relentless watchdogs. They monitor the behavior of governments, international institutions, and corporations, investigate corruption or abuses, demand transparency in global agreements and corporate supply chains, and publicize wrongdoing.
Holding power accountable, that seems vital.
Absolutely vital. They are also powerful advocates. They initiate complex, often long-term campaigns to raise public awareness about critical social, environmental, or human rights issues, mobilizing public opinion to pressure for change.
Like climate change campaigns or human rights advocacy.
Exactly. And crucially, in many parts of the world, NGOs are essential frontline service providers. They step in during humanitarian crises or in marginalized regions to deliver direct services like healthcare, education, clean water, or disaster relief, especially where the state has failed, is unwilling, or is simply absent.
Filling the gaps in basic needs.
Right. Furthermore, many NGOs act as capacity builders. They provide training, resources, and support to local communities or local NGOs to foster self-reliance, civic engagement, and help communities better navigate global challenges and opportunities on their own terms.
Empowering people locally.
Yes, and perhaps a less obvious but very important role. They are often definers of standards. NGOs frequently develop ethical codes, social standards, environmental guidelines, or operational best practices that can significantly influence industry behavior and even shape formal international law long before governments officially codify them. They set norms.
So they push the boundaries of what's considered acceptable.
They often do. And this function is really extended globally by a specific type of NGO, the transnational NGO, TNGO.
TNGO, so NGOs that operate across borders.
Precisely. These are internationally organized, independent, nonprofit organizations that pursue objectives across national boundaries. They often thrive best in democratic states where governments might recognize them as legitimate partners in strengthening governance or delivering social programs, allowing them to extend their initiatives worldwide.
Are there different kinds of TNGOs?
Yes, our sources identify three main functional types based on their primary focus. First, there are economic NGOs.
What do they do?
They primarily monitor the activities of global commercial enterprises and TNCs. They work to ensure fair competition, expose anti-competitive practices, protect domestic industries from potentially predatory global market forces, and advocate for fair labor standards in global supply chains.
Okay, keeping business in check. Second type.
Second are the highly visible environmental NGOs. Think Greenpeace or WWF. They are often the vanguard against industrial pollution and resource depletion. They conduct critical scientific research, lobby international bodies for stronger environmental treaties, run public campaigns, and sometimes engage in direct action to force governments and corporations to adopt more sustainable policies. They're often at loggerheads with powerful interests.
Definitely high profile. And the third type.
And third, there are the law and human rights NGOs, organizations like Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch. These organizations act as a kind of global conscience. They relentlessly promote the principles enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UDHR, and other international human rights treaties. They investigate and document abuses, advocate for justice for victims, campaign for legal reforms, defend fundamental freedoms like speech and assembly, and challenge systemic discrimination by states or other powerful actors. They ensure the focus remains squarely on individual dignity and rights within the vast, often impersonal machinery of globalization.
So economic, environmental, and human rights TNGOs all playing crucial roles as non-state actors.
Absolutely. They are essential components of global civil society, providing crucial checks and balances in the globalized world.
Okay, we've looked at the history, the economics, the politics, the culture, the actors. Now let's bring it all together and look at the consequences. What are the actual outcomes of all these globalizing forces, especially for different parts of the world? This brings us to the concept of development.
Right. Development is generally understood as a multidimensional process. It's not just about money. It's about enhancement and transformation across multiple aspects of life, economic, political, social, cultural. It implies qualitative improvement, not just quantitative increase.
But as the skeptics and structuralists warned us, the reality is that globalization does not seem to produce equal development everywhere.
Far from it. And our sources introduce a critical counter-concept here, maldevelopment.
Maldevelopment, what does that mean?
Maldevelopment describes the negative outcome, the dark side of globalization, where developing countries, the periphery, actually suffer because of their integration into the global system. They experience deepening dependency, exploitation, and distorted internal development because globalization's progress benefits some parts of the system of the core, often directly at the expense of others. It creates systemic, structural conflict and inequality.
So development for some is maldevelopment for others.
That's the stark argument, yes. To really measure true progress and try to avoid this trap of maldevelopment, we need to look beyond just economic growth, which is simply the quantitative increase in GDP that we discussed earlier.
Right, growth isn't the whole story.
Not at all. We need to examine at least 4 essential dimensions of development simultaneously to get a real picture.
4 dimensions. Okay, what are they?
First, economic development itself, but understood qualitatively. This emphasizes changing the fundamental structures of an economy, diversifying away from just raw materials, increasing productivity, improving technology, enhancing the skills and capabilities of the workforce, creating better jobs, reducing inequality within the economy. It's about the quality of growth, not just the quantity.
Okay, better economic structures. Second dimension.
Second, human development. This puts people firmly at the center. It prioritizes improving human welfare directly, things like better health outcomes, longer life expectancy, higher educational attainment, access to basic services, personal security, and political freedoms. The UN's Human Development Index, HDI, tries to capture this.
So focusing on people's well-being and capabilities. Third.
Third is territorial development. This focuses on achieving balanced regional growth within a nation. It's about actively reducing geographic inequalities between rich and poor regions, or between urban centers and rural areas, to prevent internal polarization and ensure development benefits are shared more widely across the national territory.
Spreading the benefits geographically. And the fourth dimension.
And finally, arguably the most critical dimension today, sustainable development.
Sustainability. We hear this word constantly.
Yes, and its core principle is fundamentally intergenerational, meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. It links economic progress directly to environmental protection and social equity.
Okay, that sounds good in principle, but how do you actually measure if development is sustainable? It seems tricky.
It is tricky. Paul Streeton and Dennis Goulet provided a useful framework with 6 specific criteria for assessing sustainable development in practice.
6 criteria for sustainability. Let's hear them.
First, the maintenance of capital assets, both natural, like forests, clean water, and man-made, infrastructure, machinery. Don't deplete your core assets. Second, ensuring environmental conditions remain healthy and stable. Third, building resiliency in both economic and social systems to withstand shocks like climate change or financial crises.
Okay, maintaining assets, environment, resilience. What else?
Fourth, critically, avoiding internal and external debt that could burden future generations. Fifth, ensuring fiscal and political sustainability, stable government finances, and predictable governance. And sixth, crucially, promoting citizen control and local ownership over development projects and resources, ensuring they are genuinely responsive to local needs and priorities.
That's a comprehensive list. Asset maintenance, environment, resilience, avoiding debt, stable governance, and local control.
Exactly. These principles are really the foundation, or at least the aspiration, behind the current global roadmap for development. The Sustainable Development Goals.
SDGs.
The 17 goals the UN adopted. Right. Adopted in 2015, it's this ambitious 15-year plan aiming for equitable and sustainable global growth across all countries, covering everything from poverty and hunger to climate action and gender equality.
And how is the world supposed to actually implement these ambitious goals?
Well, the implementation framework is guided by the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, also from 2015. This focuses heavily on aligning national development plans with the SDGs, mobilizing diverse financial resources, public-private international, promoting science and technology, building capacity in developing countries, and securing multi-stakeholder contributions, getting government, business, and civil society all pulling in the same direction.
It sounds like a solid plan on paper, but do the SDGs face criticism?
Oh, absolutely. They face some pretty tough criticism. One major point is that their scope is seen as excessively broad, 17 goals, 169 targets. Critics argue it's trying to fix everything simultaneously, losing focus and making prioritization impossible.
Trying to boil the ocean.
Kind of. Another criticism is that many goals aim for an often unrealistic zero, like zero poverty, zero hunger. While laudable aspirations, critics say setting absolute zero goals by 2030 potentially sets the entire framework up for perceived failure and disillusionment.
That's a fair point. Any other criticisms?
Yes, a significant one relates back to those governance gaps. The universality of the SDGs applying equally to all countries, rich and poor, creates real accountability challenges. Developing nations often bear a disproportionate responsibility for implementation, despite having far fewer resources and capacities, while the historical responsibilities of wealthier nations, for example for climate change, aren't always adequately reflected in the burden sharing. Who holds whom accountable?
So noble goals, but massive challenges in implementation and fairness.
Precisely. And this lack of truly equitable outcomes brings us right back to the persistent, stark reality of the global divide.
The global divide, the gap between rich and poor countries.
Yes, that persistent socioeconomic inequality that functionally separates the world, despite all the interconnectedness globalization brings.
How do we characterize this divide? What are the terms used?
We often characterize it using the terms global north and global south.
North versus south. Is it strictly geographical?
Not strictly, though there's a rough correlation. The global north generally refers to the highly industrialized, technologically advanced countries, primarily in North America and Europe, plus Japan, Australia, New Zealand. These are typically the centers of financial and political power, often dictating the terms of global engagement, high living standards, stable governments.
Okay. And the global south?
The global south encompasses regions often excluded from the centers of power, much of Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, MENA region, South Asia, and parts of the Pacific. These regions often face challenges like entrenched poverty, chronic dependence on foreign aid or remittances, weaker governance structures, vulnerability to climate change, and legacies of colonialism. The term emphasizes systemic inequality and marginalization rather than just latitude.
Acknowledging it's about power and structure, not just geography. So, what caused this severe divergence, this divide, to persist or even widen in the era of supposedly connecting globalization? Our sources must point to some reasons.
They do. They point to three main interconnected drivers behind the persistence of the global divide, especially since the acceleration of globalization in the 1990s.
Okay, what's the first driver?
First, the sheer speed and nature of globalization in the 1990s, particularly the emphasis on rapid financial liberalization and free market reforms. Many weaker economies in the South, often struggling with unstable governments or recovering from conflict or debt crises, simply could not adapt quickly enough. They failed to compete effectively with the already advanced economies, and the gap widened almost instantly in relative terms.
So the starting line wasn't fair, and the race got faster.
That's a good way to put it. Second, uneven immigration patterns contribute significantly.
How does immigration widen the divide?
Because the flows are often skewed. Highly skilled, educated, and entrepreneurial labor doctors, engineers, scientists, tech workers flows overwhelmingly to the global north in search of better opportunities and salaries. This creates a severe brain drain from the South, depleting the human capital needed for domestic development.
While the money sent back helps families.
Right. While the low-skilled labor remittances we discussed earlier provide crucial income, NFIA, the loss of high-skilled workers deepens the structural dependency of the South on the North. It's a complex, often counterproductive dynamic.
Brain drain. Okay. And the third driver?
And third, fundamentally, the hegemonic economic relations themselves. This refers back to the structuralist critique. International financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank, despite their stated goals of development, are largely dominated by the powerful states of the global north.
So their policies reflect northern interests.
Critics argue that the policies they often promote or impose, like structural adjustment programs in the past, are frequently silent on, or even detrimental to, the specific long-term needs and contexts of the developing world. This imbalance of power within the core institutions of global economic governance helps to maintain the divide, locking the periphery into structural disadvantages.
It sounds like a self-perpetuating cycle.
It can certainly feel that way, but there are efforts to counter this. There's a strong push, particularly from countries within the Global South, for South-South cooperation.
South-South cooperation, what does that entail?
It's about developing countries working together, sharing resources, knowledge, and technology, and supporting each other politically and economically outside the traditional North-South aid or trade relationships. The Buenos Aires Plan of Action, BAPA, adopted back in 1978 and reaffirmed since, provides a key framework for this.
So building solidarity and strength among developing nations.
Exactly. It aims to foster self-reliance, create alternative development pathways, enhance collective bargaining power in global negotiations, and build institutional support networks among developing nations. It's an attempt to build parallel systems and promote shared development goals based on mutual benefit and understanding, challenging the North-dominated structure.
A way to try and rebalance the scales from within the Global South itself.
That's the core idea, yes.
Yeah.
A crucial strategy for navigating the challenges of the global divide. #tag outro.
Wow. Okay, that was an absolute immense synthesis. We've gone from, 1492 and mercantilism all the way through the Industrial Revolution, Bretton Woods, the rise of the individual in 3.0, the five scapes of culture, the role of NGOs, and right up to the SDGs and the stark reality of the global divide.
We covered a lot of ground.
We really did. And the core takeaway, which I think our sources make absolutely clear, is that globalization is, well, it's deeply contested, isn't it? It's intensely multifaceted, and it's profoundly consequential for everyone.
Definitely. It accelerates connections and awareness, maybe pushing us slowly toward that condition of globality.
But at the same time, it simultaneously exposes and often actively widens these deep systemic inequalities, really solidifying that global divide we just discussed. It's a paradox.
It truly is. So what does this all mean? Where does this leave us?
Well, the source material consistently frames globalization as essentially an inescapable process. Whether you're a hyperglobalist or a skeptic, it's happening. And as we heard early on, it's potentially a cure for parochialism, for being stuck in that local bubble.
Right. And the power of that global imaginary we talked about, that growing awareness of interconnectedness combined with the technological shift towards globalization 3.0.
Where the individual is empowered, the main actor.
Exactly. That potentially grants you, the listener, an unprecedented opportunity and maybe even a responsibility.
Okay, so here's the final provocative thought, building on all this. You are now informed, hopefully, about the mechanics, the long history, the competing views, and the structural traps within this global system. How might you, as a newly conscious global participant, leverage your unique position?
What can you do? Beyond just being a consumer in this global marketplace, how could you push, in your own way, for more fairness, more cooperation, maybe address some of those governance gaps or that maldevelopment we talked about?
And thinking about those TNGOs, the ones fighting for human rights based on the Universal Declaration, what idea, what principle, perhaps beyond the UDHR, should the next generation of transnational movements or NGOs be built upon? What's the next big idea needed to truly tackle the persistent, brutal inequality of the global divide in this increasingly interconnected world?
Something profound to think about as you navigate this complex, contested, and undeniably flat world.
Definitely something to mull over. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.